Hello and welcome to Infinity. I'm Charlie Seraphin. For the next half hour, we're going to be talking about channeling. Our guest is William Kautz. Dr. Kautz is the director of the Center for Applied Intuition in San Francisco. Until recently, he was at SRI International, the Stanford Research Institute, where he was a staff scientist for some 34 years. Dr. Kautz has used his knowledge of computer science in the study of the creative process and intuition. Channeling. What is it?
Channeling, Charlie, is a special property of the human mind to be able to set aside our normal conscious thinking process, we might say our personality, so that other information can drift in and ultimately be expressed and communicated to others. It's a very common phenomenon. It's even normal. It's been happening behind the scenes and not so much out in the public eye for millennia, though it's getting to be very popular nowadays in the, you might call it the underground.
Is channeling like emptying?
In a way it is. It's getting stuff out of the way, this normal chatter that goes on within our minds, and all these ego effects of who we think we are, which is usually wrong, and getting those things out so that they do not interfere with the clarity of mind that's necessary to allow channeling to take place.
Is there a physical process associated with channeling?
Not particularly. It seems to be an entirely a mental one, although there can often be some small physical side effects.
Some people suggest that running is a great activity because it empties the mind, and you can go out and run, and for the first whatever distance, you think all the trivial little thoughts and all the little problems at work and all those things, but after a while you go through a point when that kind of fades away and you get in touch with a different self that's there.
That's surely absolutely correct for some people, though it probably doesn't work that way for everybody. It's just a matter of what does it take for you to get the chatter down and to achieve clarity of mind. It'll be many, many ways for many different people. That's how it works. But basically you could say that it's a meditative process. This is the goal of meditation, to clear the mind and to open it up to whatever wants to come through. And there are a lot of ways to do meditation. There are a lot of ways to get into meditation. Running can be one of them.
When you get into channeling, and I'm going to use the word here somewhat loosely, when this other consciousness arises in an individual, is there a voice associated with it?
Not necessarily. The idea is that when you achieve this point of clarity, information or knowledge can float to consciousness by itself. Now, most of us have trouble with that idea. We don't really want it to happen. Therefore, it usually comes through one of the senses, like we hear a voice, or we see pictures, or we'll feel things in our body sometimes, if we're talking about things that have a body connection. But the sense that it comes through doesn't seem to be a very important thing. It's like a temporary thing. And many people who start hearing voices will be seeing pictures next month, and finally they just often let that go, and they'll get the information directly when the questions are asked.
If we hear a voice, and let's start with that one, and we'll move on to the other methods. If we hear a voice, is the voice that I hear the same voice that you hear?
Certainly not, because we create our own voices. As I say, it's just a way of expression. It's a form of manifestation of the inner knowledge that's coming through. But you hit on a good point. So whether the knowledge that comes through is the same.
That was the next question.
All right.
Is the source of the information the same source?
Well, the authorities are still arguing about that. We don't really know what the source of information is about this. We can ask the information itself, that is, just ask the channeling process, where does this come from? And the general answer we get is, this knowledge is just out there, it's available, or in there. It's just available to everybody. It's a common universal source. It doesn't have a where even. We like to think that everything has to have a where. So we just open ourselves up and it floats in to us. But if you look at all of the great religions of the world, they've got some name for this source. So they know the concept. They sometimes call it the Book of God's Remembrance. Jung called it the collective unconscious. In the East, they call it the Akashic Records. It's a name for the concept of this universal knowledge just being available and out there for anybody to tap. But clearly, it's not the property of any one religion or religious approach to do that.
We have heard stories of individuals who have gone outside of the normal realm of what they thought of themselves. Let's take, for example, a housewife who had never done any painting, and all of a sudden, in a fit of inspiration, turns out a Picasso-like painting that is acclaimed by the critics as being something very special. Or someone that's fiddled around with the piano a little bit and gets into another state of mind and has written a symphony. Are these myths, or have some of these things actually happened? Have there been research?
They certainly have happened. In fact, there was a demonstration of this before a couple hundred people at San Francisco State just a few days ago. A Brazilian psychologist who goes into this special state of consciousness in which he sets his conscious mind aside, and he paints frantically and almost in the dark paintings that are very closely in the style of Picasso and Rembrandt and others. When the lights come on, you can see these, and it's an amazing process when this happens. Yes, it is for real. How does it happen? Well, these particular individuals are again tapping this collective unconscious, or this pool of human knowledge, and they have happened to allow themselves to open up and manifest in this particular way through painting.
Maybe we haven't resolved it yet, but do the individuals involved in this process of channeling know whether the information that is coming into their being, into their consciousness, is from within themselves or from another source?
Well, I could answer that question better if you could tell me what's in and what's out. We don't have those models working in psychology. It's as if it's as if you're saying it's got to have a where, it's got to have a place where it comes from, and that isn't necessarily so. Maybe it's possible for things to exist just in the ethers or without having a location. That seems to be what's going on.
Can one channeling? In other words, is it possible to predetermine what is going to be the end result of that, what I called earlier, the emptying process? Do you just create the void and see what pops in, or can you kind of predict what's going to come?
Well, of course, you don't predict it totally, presumably, but what you can do is ask questions of it. And this is the norm. This is the way that it's usually used. We at the Center for Applied Intuition do this all the time. We've done 400 or 500 channelings, so-called, or sessions, in which we are in control in the sense that we are asking the questions that we want answers to. This is done both in personal counseling for individuals who are seeking guidance in their lives. It's done in scientific areas when we need information that science has not been able to provide us. It's done in business. It's done in inquiries into history, where we want to recreate history which has been otherwise lost. Practically any information can be obtained by this means of simply formulating, posing the questions, and then receiving the answers. It seems to be all there, and there seem to be very few limits on what can be obtained.
Let's put it down to the specific level if we can, and I'm going to come to you, and I'm someone that has quote open mind to channeling, and I would like to try the process and see if I can't tap in to the collective unconscious and just see what's going to happen. And we determine that we're going to make a connection, if we can, with something that involves literature and writing, and I'm going to have a pencil. Would that be a starting point?
That would be a starting point. If you're going to do this yourself, that is, if you're going to be the channel for this information, then we would put you through a training program to prepare you for this. That is, we teach you how to get these blocks, these obstacles out of the way that are in your, let's say, your subconscious mind, that are preventing the natural flow of this information from coming in. We have such a program, and we operate it all the time. So, however, if you're coming as an inquirer and you're going to work with, let's say, one of these intuitives who's spent some time practicing and is really, really good, then you would come prepared with questions to ask. And you would pose those questions, get answers. That would perhaps suggest additional questions. And you can simply have in most cases, you can have a dialogue with the channel and until you're satisfied that you have received the information you want. Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about literature again. Let's say we're going to focus on Mark Twain,
Mm-hmm.
and whether we're doing it through me or whether we're doing it through an intuitive. Let's take the intuitive. I come to you and I say, I'm going to read you a passage from one of Mark Twain's works. Can you tell me what Mark Twain was thinking about at the time that he wrote this and why he
That's right.
constructed this passage this way?
That's quite possible, and we've done things just exactly like this. Anything you want to know, really. We've done 2 biographies now, one short one and one long one. The long one took 25 sessions in order to build up a detailed picture of this man's life, and we're in the process now of writing that into a book as a biographical novel.
How do you determine, again, as a scientist, the difference between what are the blocks and what are the flows?
Well, we define it functionally. That is, if we can ask questions and get answers which we have reason to believe are correct, then we consider that the process is working. If the answers are not coming, there's something in the way. That's the model we use. As to how we determine if it's correct, this can take many, many different forms. If it's scientific data, we can simply test it. We set up an experiment, or we go back in the literature, or do something, conduct an experiment. If it's personal data, well, we can ask the person. Or if it's about yourself you're asking, you'll know whether it's right or not. Mm-hmm.
Do we always look back, or do we have the potential to look ahead?
You can look forward, absolutely.
Have you made a killing on the stock market?
Well, there's some conditions on future work, whether you're getting it from a channel or some other means, because not all of the future is determined yet. It depends on human decisions. So to the extent that those decisions have already been made, yes, you can get future. Or to the extent that these are natural phenomena, like earthquakes and events like that, then you can get that kind of information. But
what does channeling suggest about the nature of time? You suggest that some things in the future are subject to human decisions which have yet to be made, so you can't tap into that?
Well, the source from which this is coming seems to be rather independent of time. We've asked these questions about time many times, and this is the answer we get, that like where this information is coming from, time is kind of illusory. And they say, actually, in your world, it's also illusory, but you just don't know that yet. But I think the best answer to your question is that, yes, much of the future is already determined, and questions can be asked about it, and the answers can be provided. It may not be in your best interest to know. So there is a kind of protective process going on that doesn't exactly, treats it as a secret in the best sense of the word. That is, with information withheld out of the interest of the listener, for the sake of the listener. There may be information about an accident that's going to happen to you next week, a very positive accident that you need in your life in order to go through a certain stage of growth, but it wouldn't help you now to know about that. It's better that it just happen in due course. Otherwise, you'd be thrown into a panic for a week. And there are other occasions where information is not good to have it. But by and large, any part of the future that's determinable seems to be accessible to us.
Again, I don't know how interested you are in doing this, but I can think of a couple of experiments that I would like to try that have to do with verification and get it back into the scientific mode so we can write it up. What if you were to say something like, list for me the names of the members of the House of Commons in 1987, in January 1987, or take some date that was a future date from the time of the experiment, write them down and then wait until that time comes and
Yeah.
compare the actual with the channeled information.
Well, I could anticipate what would happen there, that you'd get some of the names, and there'd be a few that you couldn't get because it's not yet decided by humans as to what those individuals are going to be. That's the way it works.
Are you particularly concerned about verification in this process?
Well, we are in our own way, but when you say verification, you have to know what you mean. If you're talking about scientific verification, we are concerned about scientific verification in those inquiries in which scientific topics are being studied. But for other areas, we would prefer to verify in non-scientific ways, that is through direct personal exposure. Sometimes we don't bother to verify, we just go out and use the information under the assumption that it will work, and it always has.
What's an example of that?
Well, we use these expert intuitives, as we call them, as kind of counsels on some of our business activities, planning projects, laying out opportunities, raising money, and so on. Well, we ask for where can we get funding for such and such a source, for such and such a project, what source can we use? So the guidance is given on this, sometimes specific names, sometimes classes of organizations, or sometimes information about there's a large source, a nonprofit organization in Atlanta, and leaving it to us to do the research to find that. So I don't know, how do you verify something like that except by just going out and trying it? And we're not usually disappointed. Sometimes we don't feel we want to make the effort, or we don't have the resources to explore all these things, but generally we found this to be very good counsel.
Is there a moral standard involved in channeling? And I kind of touched on it earlier when I teased about, have you made a killing in the stock market? Mm-hmm. Is it possible to use this process for material individual gain?
It certainly is, though you have to remember that this is a need-driven process. If you go in to your inquiry asking pointless questions, either questions whose answers you already know, or you're just curious without any kind of other motive, then you're going to get fuzzy answers. This is our experience. It's like you're performing a test, and who cares? I mean, how is humanity, or even you, being really served by that kind of information which satisfies that test?
Have you tried some of those things?
Oh, sure.
Score of a baseball, football game, result of a horse race, that sort of thing?
We predicted 5 earthquakes in a row back many years ago. Our motive then was to set out some instruments so that we could make measurements during those earthquakes. That didn't actually work out, but we got very accurate predictions on the 5 earthquakes. So it, dates, times, sizes, locations, and so on. So we know that is possible. But we don't like to conduct tests, and even when we're trying out new people, we don't put them through the works by asking them questions that we already know the answers to.
What is an intuitive?
An intuitive is a person who practices intuition and has a certain degree of competence in it.
How do you get to be one?
Well, that's a good question. Anybody can do it, because intuition is a natural human faculty. It's universal. It's like a lot of other things, sleeping, dreaming, walking. But normally it's dormant and latent within people. But it can be developed into a workable skill, but you have to work at it. Okay? So it takes a certain degree of effort to become a really good intuitive, to take advantage of that native ability. Now, what kind of effort? Well, it's not the kind of trying that we're used to doing when we're developing skills. Like if you want to learn how to ride a surfboard or play the violin, this takes a lot of effort of a certain type. Coordination, muscles, brain power, and so forth. With developing intuitive skills, it's more a matter of letting go. You see, we've acquired a lot through our culture, through our family being brought up, that it's not possible for information to come to us directly. We've got to work with it. We've got to somehow earn it. We've got to go through logic or thinking process, or we've got to read it in a book. This is the myth that we're living with in our part of the world. Not all cultures feel that way. They operate in much more of intuitive modes, particularly primitive cultures that don't have access to books in Western civilization. So what we've got to do on our side of the world to develop intuitive skill is to learn how to decondition ourselves, to deprogram ourselves from these expectations, from these beliefs of what's possible and what's not possible. Now, in addition to that, there are some usually ego-based problems in here too that have to be cleaned out, as I mentioned earlier. Most of us are not in a condition to accept this intuitive information into our lives just like that. We're not very clear channels. We'll get a hunch now and then, or a gut feeling, or a flash, but to bring it under control, you've really got to clean out the basement. You've got to get that garbage out of there, and really connect with the source of this information in an altruistic way. Just saying, affirming, I want to be a clear channel for this information for the highest good.
Are children naturally clear channels?
Well, not totally clear, but they certainly don't have a lot of the programming and conditioning that the adults do. And of course, as we all know, children are often pretty intuitive at times. They don't know how to communicate it very well, maybe, but they'll pick up things.
Have you worked with children?
Not directly, except through my own, of course. Mm-hmm.
You say anyone can do it. Are there some people who absolutely can't?
Not as far as we know. We've met a lot of people who were very skeptical that they could, who ended up being able to do it. But of course, we haven't tried this on all 5 billion people on the planet.
What about destiny and free will? These are the classic questions that we get to in a philosophic discussion. Can you say what role those two forces play in this process?
Well, we alluded to free will in talking about prediction. That only part of the future is predictable because free will is involved, and that's a natural and even sacred right of mankind, of the human individual. And what is not free will is presumably determined or deterministic. And this is, I think, at the essence of this age-old philosophic controversy between free will and determinism. But I think the real heart of the matter goes beyond what I've been saying here. We would need to get into a greater model of man and how we are all connected. I've already alluded to the fact that this information seems to be coming from a common source. And as we can talk about our own personal subconsciouses, but this information seems to be coming from this superconscious or collective unconscious, which is shared with other people. So when we start asking questions about who we are, we're clearly not our bodies and our brains. I mean, we know that. The farther you get away from body and brain and through mind and then into this kind of superconscious, it really turns out that we're all really the same thing. We're all one, as you've heard many times. And it's just that we don't know it. We are living in a world in which we are attached to our particular identities as bodies, brains, and individual minds. But behind all of that, when we transcend that, we seem indeed to be really connected. It's like separate cells that make up one organ of the body, or that we could say make up the body. We now are living in a world where we are identified as an individual cell, but really we belong to an organ or a body, and that's really what's going on. And the challenge before us is to be able to transcend that individual identity and merge into the greater identity, the full body, which we're free to do anytime we want.
Is there one greater identity, or are there multiple greater identities?
Well, when you get there, let me know.
How is the channeling state different from the dream state or the meditative state, or are they the same?
Well, they're certainly very similar. These are altered states of consciousness in which the conscious personality is set aside. But the dream state seems to be very special in that there's a physical process that goes on as well, so that waking consciousness is totally set aside, and some sort of internal process is going on. There's no facility for direct communication with others in the dream state. But they're certainly like brothers.
That's a shame, too. We really wish there were.
Sometimes,
so we could
yes.
tap in there.
They're like brothers and sisters, though, as I see it. They're really very similar kinds of altered states. Mm-hmm.
What is the ultimate goal of channeling, or is there one?
As I see it, and many would agree with me, the ultimate goal is to find out better who we are. Because as I was saying a moment ago, the more we know about who we are, the more unified we become as members of the human species. And it's in that knowing who we are, discovering our true identity, which is the challenge for all persons. It's a kind of self-actualization to discover that identity. That seems to be the reason why we are here. And in those terms, Earth is just a schoolhouse. We're all just going through this life experience and having experiences and learning through these experiences, and some of them very painful, some very joyful, but these are all just ways and means of going through this kind of advancement of self-recognition, of finding our true identity.
Sometimes I wonder if history isn't a sort of an up and down process. The American process in many ways was the discovery of self and the individual and individuality, and that's really what was going to make this thing work, is every man for himself sort of thing. Now we're sort of going through that. I don't know how else to say it. It may come off sounding somewhat funny, but is channeling un-American in that sense?
It's certainly not un-American in that sense, no. But I think we need to make a distinction between selfness and individuality, in the sense in which you used it, of being the rugged individual with which America grew up. We've done a lot of work at the center with people in Japan. They have a different kind of selfness over there. It's very group-oriented. They have rather little individual identity. They're discovering it now, and it's rather exciting for them. But their whole orientation is toward group activity and what's good for the group and so on. And it's just a totally different way of being, of selfness. But we usually think in our culture as selfness as being individualistic and like the rugged individual, or being egotistic, selfish, the value of the self over other people. And we need to make these distinctions.
What would happen if everyone listening to this program right now were able to be channeled and were able to make that connection with the collective unconscious? Would we see any manifestation of that activity?
I doubt it, but I imagine these individuals who did it, all these people who were listening and find themselves suddenly channeling, would be lifted up to a higher plane of self-knowledge, and it can be a very, very high experience.
This is Infinity. Remember to keep your mind open and listen to your heart. I'm Charlie Seraphin. Thank you for listening.